Well, good morning, brethren. It's time to get started here. It sure turned out to be a nice day. I'm glad y'all made it out. Good. Welcome to Sabbath Services, and all those on the webcast, welcome. Glad you're able to join us. So let's begin services, and let's all stand up and sing praises to God. Let's turn to page 7. Let's sing out really well. I know I have the microphone. I can sing loud. All right, page 7. Keep God's Sabbath holy. That's what we're doing today. So let's do this. All right, page 7. Very good. Wow. I kind of like that last few verses there. It says, God's government of peace. And boy, we sure need that. All right, let's go to our second hymn on page 46. Page 46, Mount Zion stands most beautiful. And after which I've asked Mr. Chris Thomas to open with prayer. Page 46, Mount Zion stands most beautiful. Keep singing out, brother. Mount Zion. good. Thank you, brethren. And now to open services with prayer, Mr. Chris Thomas.
Great God Almighty, we bow before you on your Sabbath day, and we come before you humbly, asking you to bless this service, Father. Bless the speaking, bless the hearing, Father, for we come in your name, and we are gathered together, and we know that we read in the Scriptures, if two or more are gathered together, Father, you are with them in spirit. So we ask for that blessing to be upon us, to bless this service, and to have everything to go well, and for us to hear the encouraging words that you would have us hear. And so we turn this service over into your hands, and we ask this all in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
All right, let's be seated, and now to bring us announcements, our pastor, Mr. Blackwell.
Good morning, everyone. Small crowd here today, but that's okay. Sometimes that happens. Beautiful Sabbath day, as was mentioned already. Nice day outside. It's supposed to get fairly warm today. Be a nice day to be out this afternoon and kind of enjoy God's creation. I do have just a few announcements this morning. First off, the Ministerial Board of Directors will be meeting with the administration this next week in the office in McKinney, and I'd appreciate your prayers for God's blessing on those meetings, as well as God's guidance on what's discussed and decisions made affecting next year. So, again, having the annual meeting there this weekend, or this next week. With the size of the conference room there, and also with the Foundation Institute classroom, they can still meet and have everybody there and have social distancing so that everybody can still be there. I know there are at least a couple of the members of the Ministerial Board of Directors who won't be there. Will be doing it, meeting remotely. I know Mr. Salyer, because of the condition of his son, will not be there. And I also know Mr. Thompson will not plan on being there. So anyway, your prayers for those meetings will be very greatly appreciated, as well as everything else going on as far as we're working on getting ready for a lot of things next year. I spent part of this last week working on, would you believe, Feast of Tabernacles 2021 already. And things are coming along well. I am working with another theater, just in case, as it happens in Brent, just in case things don't work out for using the White House Theater next year. I'm working on getting another one on standby if we need it instead. I would prefer to have the White House because of the room right next door to it, the West Wing, makes it very convenient for a lot of our things. But the theater I'm working with, I'm not going to say who it is right now, but there are a number of theaters down in Branson right now that are kind of hurting a little bit and could use the business, so hopefully it'll work out. But otherwise, I'm working on housing as well. Otherwise, everything's rolling on along. Seems like things just keep moving forward inexorably, and we'll see how things go. Don't forget that on Sabbath, December 26th, we'll have services at 1 p.m., not at 10:30 a.m., 1 p.m., and we'll be joining the live webcast from the headquarters in McKinney for services that day. They normally do that during Winter Family Weekend, and since we don't have Winter Family Weekend this year, they decided to go ahead and have a combined service available anyway. So that'll be happening, so we are going to join that on that day. So if you get real tired between now and then, you can actually sleep in a little longer. Now, on the other hand, that might interfere with some of the time some of you normally take a nap. And I would just assume you not take a nap during it. But anyway, it should work out fine. Prayer requests, we do have several. A couple involving ministers, would appreciate your prayers for Mr. Larry Salyer's family. Their son, Jeff, is struggling very mightily right now. He's had a childhood birth disease, and he's in his 50s now. It's really taking its toll on him and on the family. Also, a good friend of mine, Mr. Harold Rhodes, down in southern Alabama, is pretty much bedridden now with several diseases. He's the one who had several years ago the flesh-eating bacterial disease, survived that, but he's really struggling right now. And his wife especially, she lost a brother, lost her son, lost her daughter, and now her husband is bedridden. So I know Larry Rhodes would appreciate your prayers for God's strength and comfort and encouragement as well. In addition to that, we have one here, Bob Payne from the West Palm Beach, Florida congregation, was diagnosed today with severe aortic stenosis, a narrowing of the aortic valve, restricting blood flow. The condition, which presented itself suddenly last week, caused difficulty walking and short distances, difficulty sleeping, major breathing problems, and danger of heart failure. He's scheduled to undergo emergency valve replacement surgery. This was happened yesterday, so your prayers for God's intervention and healing for him would be very greatly appreciated at this point in time. And then locally here, I'd appreciate your continued prayers for the Ferrises. They're not able to be with us again today. They're both struggling with some very serious difficulties. He has a number of difficulties. She's having difficulty being able to get around and function in that way, so your prayers for them would be appreciated. Also, your prayers for Sandy Smith's eye situation, where she's losing her eyesight, would be very greatly appreciated for God to reverse that process and cause things to go better there. Of course, I still appreciate your prayers for my wife and her situation, as well as all the other people we have who are struggling with other illnesses around here as well. That does take care of the announcements. We'll go and have another congregational hymn, and following that, we'll have the sermon.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Okay, brethren, let's do it again. I think God appreciates our songs, and like I said, sing out. I don't think he minds if you're not in tune sometime. But let's just sing out and make up for those who aren't here today. Okay, let's stand. Let's turn to page 110. This is a lovely song, How Good and How Pleasant, page 110. Let's sing out. So David did tell, like good. Thank you, brethren. And now to continue services in the sermon, Mr. Mike Blackwell.
The elderly gentleman was growing old and more feeble as time went on. He'd lost his loving wife of 50-plus years several years before. As time went on, his family thought him to be a little bit eccentric because of some of the habits and collections he had. There was one box that really intrigued them. It wasn't a big box. It was a fairly small box, wooden box. Yet he never opened it when anyone else was around. When he was alone, he would go into his room, close the door, carefully open it, and take time examining the contents, one item at a time. Then, just as carefully, he would put all the contents back in the box and put the box away, where it was locked and securely hidden. When he was gone, family members had searched for it and searched for it and searched for it to no avail. They couldn't find it. As time went on and he grew frailer and his health began to deteriorate, his offspring began to speculate, what is in that box? Someone's going to inherit it. What's in there? We got to know. We got to find out. One thought it was some very valuable stocks. Another was, no, I'm sure it's a collection of jewels and gold and silver. Others thought it was deeds to property that had become very valuable. One thing of which they were very sure, because of the way it was protected and the way it was taken care of, one thing they were very sure was it had to be very valuable, or else he wouldn't take such caution and care with it and protect it. They began to actually, in some ways, anticipate his death so they could get their hands on the contents of that box, open it up, and find out what is in there. What is it that's so valuable in there? When the elderly gentleman finally died in his sleep, they finally got their wish. They searched and searched and searched. The box was open, and they were all able to share in its contents. What was in the box? Well, I'll tell you more about that later. Did you ever look at something God did or made and wonder, why in the world did he do it that way? I have. I've looked at it now. Why in the world did God do that? Why in the world did God take care of that? Why in the world did God not do that differently? Many times we think that God does some things purposely, does other things just kind of on a whim, like we do sometimes. Just on a whim, no real reason. And again, God doesn't carefully plan it out. We can think, well, there has to be a better way to do that. And we probably all have thought at times. Then, as we see the situation unfold, we realize God's way really was indeed the best way. He did take care of it the very best way he could. We miss many important things and principles sometimes, brethren, because we simply fail to stop and ask questions such as, what is the significance of that? Have you ever read through the Bible and looked at a passage, looked at something, and said, now what is the significance of that? You know, God doesn't do anything by chance. What is the significance of that? Why did God do it that way? When God gives very specific instructions on things, he has a reason for doing so. Like when God repeats something 2 or 3 times in a short period of time in the Bible, he has a reason for doing that. It's something he says, all right, I want you to take time and really think about this. Stop and think about it. You know, there's a word in the book of Psalms that actually kind of means that. It's called Selah. S-E-L-A-H, Selah. What Selah means is, stop and think about this a minute. Stop and think about what this is talking, what just got said. Focus on it, kind of mull it over in your brain a little bit. look at it and think about it. And again, we look at it, and when we do that, we generally find out a lot more about it. One good example from this from the Old Testament, that a lot of times we don't think about, brethren, is in the building of the tabernacle and the things in it. Building of the tabernacle and the things that were in the tabernacle. You know, God was very specific, and he had a reason. You know, if you go and you begin to read through the tapestry and the coverings, had to be a certain way, woven a certain way. The poles they held up the tabernacle had to be covered with gold. And the other things in it, very, very specific that God had in mind. And again, he had a reason for it. These things we find in the New Testament were to foreshadow or as a forerunner of the heavenly temple. Forerunner of the heavenly temple. They're all important not only to God, but to us as well. We're looking, well, what's God's temple going to be like? What's God's throne going to be like? What's God's kingdom going to be like? Well, the tabernacle was a bit of a forerunner and to foreshadow what was to come, much greater that was to come. Now, again, one of the centerpiece of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant. It was probably the most important part of the tabernacle in the first temple. The Ark of the Covenant. We look at the term ark. Oh, man, that's a special term because we find it used in the Bible, ark. Noah's ark, the Ark of the Covenant. Brethren, the word ark simply means a box. Simply means a box for protection. A box in which things can be stored and protected. Noah's ark was a big box. It wasn't designed as a sailing ship. It was a big box, more or less, designed to store Noah and his family and representative of all of the animal creation and to preserve them, to keep them safe. Now, we find that as we look at it, the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God in the nation. The Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God in the nation of Israel. Let's look at Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25. Just like the elderly gentleman, the box was designed with a purpose in mind. It was designed to protect some very valuable things. Here we find Exodus chapter 25, and beginning to read in verse 10, "They shall make an ark of acacia wood." Even the type of wood was specified. 2.5 cubits shall be the length. 2.5 cubits was about, approximately 5 feet. 2.5 cubits, about 5 feet long. And 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. So it's basically 5 feet long by roughly 27 inches, something like that, by 27 inches. Not a great big thing. 5 feet long is about 2 feet wider than this, and probably a little bit narrower. So it wasn't a huge box. But again, it was fairly significant. It was very significant. But notice what God says about it. "And you shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and out." So again, very, very valuable. Shall overlay with pure gold. Again, recommending that it look like something glistening in the distance. Overlay with pure gold inside and out, and shall make it a molding of gold all around. So it had a design of gold all the way around it, too. Some kind of a floral design, but I don't know what it was, floral leaves, whatever it was. But a design of gold all the way around it. Very, very important, because you look at these things, and this was going to be God's home, as it were, with his nation. "You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in the 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, 2 rings on the other side. You shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold." So, when you stood and looked at this thing, it was absolutely spectacular. Absolutely spectacular. And he goes on, you shall put the poles into the ark, into the rings on the sides of the ark may be carried by them. You know, it's interesting. You all know what happened later on whenever the ark was taken and David was bringing it back. And a man, they brought it back on a cart. They'd forgotten about the instructions, brought it back on a cart. The cart hit a hole and started to wobble, and one of the men reached up and put his hand on the Ark of the Covenant to preserve it, hang on to it, hold on to it. And as a result, that man was killed. Now, again, God's very particular with how he does things and with his instructions. And again, we know that God gives very specific instructions on the building of the ark here. You know, and again, it symbolized God's throne amongst people. It was the center of worship of God by Israel. God showed his presence among the people at the Holy of Holies. This sat in the Holy of Holies behind the veil and about one-third of the tabernacle, behind a veil from everything else. Only the high priest was allowed to go in there. Again, it represented going before the throne of God for the people. And when God's presence was there was a cloud over it by day and a pillar of fire over it by night. They knew God's presence was there in the Holy of Holies. Again, God is close. The idea is, hey, God's very close to us. God's right here. God's close. Now, he gives very specific, and he leaves nothing out by chance as he goes on through here. And you shall put the pole shall be in the ark. They shall not be taken from it. They stayed right there. And you shall put into the ark certain things. But again, God did it very, very specific here. And he's very, very intentional. You know, he wanted to put the poles in there and leave them there so that people to learn, hey, you don't touch the throne of God. You know, you go to it and go up here before it, but that represents God's very presence here. And the poles are the way, if we have to move it, the poles are the way you pick it up and move it. You pick it up, and they put it on their shoulders or down on their arm's length down, and they carried it that way. So again, he left nothing to chance or to be guessed at. He even gave specific instruction how the ark should be transported, suspended from the gold-covered poles. Again, it was to be moved by the servants, the Levites, only. Now, we find that it stayed there in the tabernacle for a long time. At times, the tabernacle apparently wasn't used just a whole lot during the times of some of the judges, but it stayed there. Then we find in 1 Samuel an interesting incident. 1 Samuel chapter 4. 1 Samuel chapter 4. Beginning to read in verse 6. Now, when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, what does the sound of this great shout from the main camp of the Hebrews mean? Then they understood that the Ark of the Covenant had come into the camp. God's presence. Now, God has moved into the camp with his people. So the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for such a thing has never happened before. Woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians. Verse 9, be strong and conduct yourselves like men, you Philistines, that you do not become servants of the Hebrews. Verse 10, so the Philistines fought Israel, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled from his tent. There was a very great slaughter, and they fell Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. So the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So the Philistines took possession of the ark. And again, it's interesting, you look at what happened here. Verse 22. And death of the woman who stood by her. It says, and she said, the glory has departed from Israel. The ark of God has been captured. Then you find out the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, where their headquarters was, where their God was, and had all kinds of problems. They had all kinds of difficulties as a result of it. Let's look here at chapter 6. We find, or chapter 5, actually, verse 8, all the Philistines gathered together and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be carried away from Gath. So they carried the ark of God of Israel away. So it was after they had carried it away that the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great destruction, and he struck them in. Therefore they sent the ark of God to Ekron. So it was the ark of God came to Ekron, and Ekronites cried out. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of God of Israel and let it go back to the one place, so that it does not kill us anymore. So again, that's what they did. The ark of the covenant, verse chapter 6, the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. Philistines called to the priests and the diviners, saying, what shall we do with the ark? So they said, send it away. Do not send it away empty, but by all means return it to him with the trespass offering. So they sent it away. They sent it back, and we find that the ark was for a long time then. For a long time after that, the ark was just had a home, private home. Now we go all the way to 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6, and we pick up the story. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Verse 7. The anger of the Eternal was aroused against Uzzah, because again, David here, well, let's get the story back in verse 1, all right, to start out with here. Make it a little. And David gathered all the children of Israel together, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people with him from Baale Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name the Lord of hosts, who dwelled between the cherubims. So again, they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it. Good intentions, negligence. You know, they didn't do it the way God said do it. And we find that they didn't have proper respect for it, and God taught them a very valuable lesson. God was so particular and concerned that when the ark was being brought back on a cart, it almost fell off. The man named Uzzah reached up, and he died on the spot because they didn't follow the specific instructions. God is very particular. God is very particular. And again, you look at it, and you find that he eventually brought it back. They eventually brought it back. As I said, the word ark means a box, a chest, or a coffer used to keep valuable things sure and safe. Again, the ark of Noah kept Noah and his family safe. In this case, the ark of the covenant was a box that was used to keep certain things sure and safe as well. And interesting, if you look at the way God designed it, where was the judgment seat? We don't know. Where was the mercy seat? The mercy seat sat on top of the ark. The mercy seat sat on top of the ark with a cherubim on each side with its wings over covering the mercy seat, as it were, covering and protecting and standing there worshiping God. Because again, the mercy seat itself represented where God resided, represented God's throne in heaven. And very, very important. The ark made the foundation under the mercy seat. And in the ark were three things. In the ark were three things. Let's go back again to Exodus chapter 25. I purposely stopped reading in a particular spot. What was in the Ark of the Covenant? Exodus chapter 25. Verse 6 says, "You shall put in the Ark of the Covenant the two tables of the testimonies, which I will give you." So the pillar or the stones that God carved the Ten Commandments on were put in the ark. Now we find later, as they got later toward the Promised Land and got to the Promised Land, there were two other items put in there for safekeeping. The two items, it seems kind of strange when you first think of the two items. You know, if you had to keep the most important items for God and for Israel and their relationship with God, three items to put in the mercy seat or in the ark. What would you pick? Well, the Ten Commandments, obviously. The other two make a little bit less sense when you first look at it. Aaron's rod was put in there. And the third item was a pot of manna. Now, manna had been around every day for 40 years. That doesn't seem like it'd be really, why would that be chosen as a third item to go inside the Ark of the Covenant? But as we go through here, you'll find that each one of those three things played a very major role and demonstrated a very major part of God's dealing with his every very major part. Now, did you ever wonder why these things were chosen? Was it just by chance? Was it just to preserve them? Why did he choose these particular things? Well, brethren, he did it out of love and concern for them and love and concern for us today. God does nothing by chance or accident. Everything he does is intentional. And again, he doesn't do things haphazardly or negligently. The ark and the things stored in it are very important, not only for them, but especially for us today, too. Especially, brethren, in light of the times we're entering into right now. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4, tells us a little bit more about them. In the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. And verse 4, talking about the holy place or the tabernacle. They had behind the second veil, and called the holiest of all, or holy of holies, verse 3, which had the golden censer, the ark of the covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Now, how do I know that those things were in, all three weren't in from the beginning? Well, we have a pretty good idea because you find out that rod was used very regularly down through time. And the things put in there was kept in there for preservation. So, again, each of these three things were vital to God, but they're vital to God's people today. What did the ark itself stand for? What did the ark itself stand for? Let's look at that before we look at the things that were in the ark. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 25 again, verse 21. Exodus chapter 25. Should have told you we're going to go back there a couple of times, but Exodus chapter 25. Verse 21. You shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give to the commandments of the children of Israel. So, what did it picture? Again, the ark of the covenant served as the base of the mercy seat, God's throne among his people. God's throne among his people. Where he talked to them, it was the foundation of God's greatness. The foundation that God spoke to, the foundation God taught them from. Taught about his mercy. Again, the things placed in it had a lot to do with God's care, God's greatness, and God's mercy. Now, again, as we look at it, we find that the items in the Ark of the Covenant were chosen because each one of them had a special meaning for Israel. Each one of them had a special meaning for Israel as far as its relationship with its Creator. A very special meaning that related to its relationship with its Creator. They each had a major impact on Israel's belief system and its relationship with the Creator God. Let's see what we can find out about how these impacted the belief and the faith of the children of Israel. We begin with the manna, then go to Aaron's rod, and end up with the most obvious, the tables of the covenant. What was manna? Why was manna put in there? You know, the word manna means what's it? What's it? Why was it given the covenant for protection, safekeeping as a memorial? Remember that when God gave it, he said, what, you got to eat it all that day because the next day it's going to spoil. Except on Friday, on the preparation day, you gather twice as much and it won't spoil on the Sabbath, which itself was a miracle pointing to God's and how important the Sabbath was. But this golden pot that was put in there was preserved for posterity. It didn't go bad in a day, it didn't go bad in 2 days. It stayed there. God had a very special reason for it. God had a very special reason. Why was it there? Well, let's look at Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. And verse 14. When the layer of dew lifted on the surface of the wilderness, there was small, round substance, so fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said with one accord, "What is it?" or "What's it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to the children of Israel, "This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each man's need, 1 homer for each person, according to the number of your household." So God said, gather it. And again, God able to send bread from heaven. Supernatural sustenance. Supernatural sustenance for his people to keep them going. And it came directly from God. Could not be attributable to anyone else or any other actual event. You know, when he brought the quail in, people said, oh, well, that was just a natural thing that periodically, every so many years, the quail have a greater population and the wind blew them in. I don't think so. But somebody might reason around that one. You can't reason around what's it, which nobody had ever seen before, nobody knew where it came from, and it was delicious. It worked out very, very well. Again, it was a sign of God's deliverance. Verse 6, Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, that evening you shall know that the Eternal has brought you out of the land of Egypt. You're going to know that God delivered you. Again, it was a sign of God's deliverance through his care and his feeding and providing for them. Verse 7 says, in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. You know, you shall see the glory of the Lord. So again, this was given to help them feed them, but also to see the glory of God. It was unlike anything had ever done. Nobody had ever seen or heard anything like this, and yet it happened. Every day except on the Sabbath. Verses 19 and 20, we find again it was very fragile. And Moses said, let no one leave any until the morning. Notwithstanding, they did not hear Moses, but some of them left part of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. So, again, they had to depend on God to provide it every day. every day. Later in the New Testament, Christ, speaking of spiritual, says, give us this day our daily bread. Now, it wasn't saying, give us enough to eat today. What he's really saying is take care of us every day. Take care of us every day. And that's really what God's doing here. God's teaching, I'm going to take care of you every day. There was something in it that built faith as they were provided just enough for each day. They couldn't gather up extra and say, well, I'm going to go out and gather a whole bunch and I'm going to take a 2-week vacation. Didn't work. Didn't work, brethren. They had to gather just enough. God did not want them to begin to feel self-sufficient. Verse 22 to 24 says that again. When it was brought out on Friday, it didn't rot. Now, you find that maybe some still weren't convinced. Okay, go to verse 27, and we find, interestingly enough, it happened that some of the people went out on the Sabbath day to gather, but didn't find any. You know, another miracle. It comes 6 days, and it quits on the 7th day. You know, the manna actually pointed out not only God's care and God's taking care of them and God's feeding them, it pointed out the importance of the Sabbath. Pointed out the importance of the Sabbath day. Because another miracle, once a week, overnight, it didn't happen. 6 days it happened, 7th day it didn't. God rested from all his labor, we find in the beginning of Genesis. So, again, you look at it. Verse 31, interestingly enough, verse 31 here, we find, and the house of Israel called its name manna, and it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Again, God not only provided for his people, but God provided something that was nutritious and delicious. And it was the perfect nutritious food, and it was delicious to the taste. Now, it had to be delicious to the taste if that's what you eat for 40 years. You know. Because, again, it has to be something that has a continual enjoyment benefit. It was flavorful and delicious, not just nutritious. You know, back when I worked with the youth teen camps, I taught a wilderness survival class, overnight wilderness survival. And we had 3 classes with the kids, and then I took a bunch of them out in the wilderness, out in the national forest. And we had to live all that afternoon, night, and the next morning. One of the things I taught them how to make was cattail soup, cattail stew. That's the roots of cattails. You chop them up and boil them, and it's nutritious. However, some of the girls said, "Ew, this doesn't taste good." And I said, "Hey, I didn't promise you it taste good. I said it'll keep you alive." Well, hey, God took care of it and made it taste good too. Tasted delicious. So it shows God's concern for his people. God wants his people to be happy and to be concerned, be contented. Now, in order to make sure they remembered God's provision for them and care for them every day, notice verse 32 and 34 here as we end this chapter. Verse 32 and verse 32 to 34. Then Moses said, "This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Fill an omer with it and be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a pot and put an omer of manna in it and lay it up before the Lord to be kept for your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Moses laid it up before the testimony to be kept. And the children of Israel ate manna for 40 years. So, again, in order for them to remember, God said, okay, remember, I want you to remember what this pictures and what this symbolizes. So he had them take up a bunch and hang on to it. Now, interesting, probably some other people a little bit skeptical thought, well, tomorrow morning it'll have worms in it, because it does in my place. No worms. Well, next week it'll have worms. No worms. 40 years later, no worms. Again, God took care of it. And God made sure it did a job for them. They had it for 40 years. 40 years. Now let's look at a couple of other places that are interesting that God talks about manna. Psalm 78. Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a very interesting psalm. Psalm 78, verse 22. Because they did not believe God and did not trust in his salvation. Verse 23. Yet he had commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven that rained down manna on them to eat, and had given them the bread from heaven. Men ate angels' food. It tasted so good. And he sent food for them to the fill. He caused an east wind to blow over the heavens, and by the power brought the south wind. Here he rained down meat also for them. And he let them fall in the midst of the camp, all around the dwelling. So, again, we find that they didn't trust God. Didn't trust God to take care of them. Now, again, how would he take care of them and help increase their faith? As I said, he could have had a whole herd of wild beef or wild goats come in. He didn't. How would that have increased their faith? He took care of them and yet also increased their faith and trust in them. He gave them perfect food and filled all their needs on a daily basis. So they had to come back and keep focusing on him every day, every day, every day. You know, if I remember in the New Testament, Paul says, the outer man is perishing, but the inner man is renewed, what? Week by week? No. Day by day. Day by day. God's manna helped them to be reinforced every day. God wanted them to remember his care. He wanted to remember his feeding them. He wanted to taking care of their every need for 40 years. God never left them high and dry, except whenever they had to learn a lesson occasionally. Nehemiah chapter 9. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 20. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 20. Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 20. You also gave them your good spirit to instruct them, did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. They didn't have foot shoe problems. You know, a pair of shoes today would last 40 years cause all of the shoe industry to go out of business, you know. But God took care of them. God took care of them. Again, the manna symbolizes God's care. He held nothing back they needed, but gave them everything that was necessary and beneficial. You begin to see why that pot of manna is important, not only to them, but for us to think about today. Recognizes God's care, recognizes God's providing on a regular basis, recognizes God's taking care of us. They lack nothing. Even their clothes and their shoes didn't wear out. They still fit, which would be another miracle. You know, we look at it and we find that they were able to go for 40 years. 40 years of it. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8 here, very briefly. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Verse 3, he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know, notice, make you know that man should not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Very important lesson there. Man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. They couldn't take care of themselves. They had to have God. They needed God. He wanted to teach them dependence on him. always looking to him for the answers, always seeking the answers from God. Let's look at verse 16 here. Verse 16 says, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know. Notice that he might humble you, and that he might test you or try you to do you good in the end. You know, the tests and the trials were for what? To do you good. You know, sometimes we look at tests and trials and we can't figure out, well, why that? It says the tests and trials are to do you good in the end. They're for your benefit in the long run. That's hard to remember when you're up to your neck in troubles. But that's what God very, very plainly says here. To humble you and put you to the test. Would they respond to him, express thanks to him, and rely on him for the good he wanted to give them? Pretty important thing. You can see why that was there. In describing why the pot of manna was in the ark, Albert Barnes in Barnes' Notes says, a small quantity of manna was to be present as a perennial reminder of the food they had eaten and the goodness God had given them in supplying their needs. As the manna would rot quickly and this manna was preserved, it would be a perpetual miracle in proof of the presence of God's faithfulness and his ability in providing everything they needed and caring for them. New Testament talks about it. Christ in John 6 says, God fed your fathers manna, bread from heaven. Let's look at John chapter 6, verse 33. John chapter 6, verse 33. Don't want to get too involved in this one because we've got two more to go through here. John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Verse, when it says, Christ says, do not murmur as your fathers murmured. No one, I'm not sure, that's 43, John, verse 33. For the bread of God is he who comes down. So Christ uses the manna here to talk about him, as he provides for us. He takes care of us. It's similar to Jesus Christ who did spiritually give us life. Verse 47. He says, most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and are dead. They took care of them, but they died still. He's saying here that, you know, he does spiritually provide the nourishment for us that's needed spiritually. Just as he in the Old Testament used the manna to provide for them physically. So again, it's very, very important. Now, again, the Sonsino commentary talking about manna says, the manna was to be saved so that they would see it and derive spiritual lessons connected with it. Spiritual lessons. Trust in God and believe in his providence, his mercy, and his taking care of you. That's from the Sonsino Jewish commentary. You know, every time Israel saw or thought of the manna, they'd be reminded of God's great care. God's providing for them, of his providing all their needs for 40 years, feeding them both physically and spiritually. They thought of his providing for them and nourishing them in his perfect care in the wilderness. You know, we need to learn a lesson from it as well, brethren. We need to learn that lesson. The manna would remind us of how much God cares for us and the great care God shows in providing for us everything we need, how he carefully cares and provides for us, filling all of our needs. Okay, let's go on now. What about the second item? What about the second item? What's the significance of Aaron's rod that budded? Again, I'm taking more time with these first two because the significance of the third item, God's law, is more obvious. But what about Aaron's rod that budded? It was also in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this rod was very special. The incident recording the rod budding in Numbers and was going to show where God was working and to warn people about not rebelling against him. According to the Bible and the commentaries, it seems like the rod talked about here, called various things. It's called Moses' rod, Aaron's rod, the rod of the eternal, but again, it's the same rod. Sonsino and Barnes' Notes both say, the rod of Moses used by Aaron at Moses' bidding. Again, for support to that, you can compare Exodus chapter 7, verses 15 to 20, and Exodus 17, verse 5, where one passage said Moses did something with the rod, and the other says it was Aaron that did it. They're referring to the same event. So, again, there's one rod. Let's look at both passages we go through here. First incident of this rod, Exodus chapter 4. Exodus, the 4th chapter. Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4, verses 2 to 4. God, the Eternal, said to Moses, "What is that in your hand?" Moses said, "It's a rod." And God said, "Cast it on the ground." So Moses cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. Must have been related to a lot of us in here. Snake comes on, I'm gone. But it says, then the Eternal said to Moses, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." That's probably one of the greater trials Moses had faith-wise at that point in time in his life. You got this snake, and most of the snakes in the Middle East are poisonous. It's okay, you create it, now reach down and grab it by the tail. You know what happens when you grab most snakes by the tail? You have the head too in about half a second. So he reached down and grabbed it, but caught it by the tail, and it became a rod in his hand again. Again, that's the very first incident. And God says, with this rod you'll show signs. Verse 5, that they may believe that the eternal God is their fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob has sent you. Furthermore, the Lord said, now put your hand in your bosom. So it goes on to another incident here. But again, verse 17, we have the same thing. You shall take this rod in your hand with you, which you shall do the signs. So, again, now let's go on down. Interestingly enough, verse 20, then Moses took with his wife and his sons and set out with the rod of God in his hand. So now the same rod is called the rod of God. It was called the rod of Moses, now it's called the rod of God. Okay, let's go over to chapter 7, Exodus chapter 7. I'm not going to read all the way through here. You can read chapter 7 all the way, verse 7 all the way through 20. Again, Exodus chapter 7, verse 9. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh speaks to you and say, show me a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it on before Pharaoh. Now it's called Aaron's rod. It's the same rod. Same rod used by all of them. Now, we find that it not only did them all kinds of miracles. The rod brought on all kinds of miracles. It was used to bring all kinds of miracles. You find it was used to this. You find in verse 15 that it was used to turn the rivers to blood. You find in chapter 8, verse 5, again, not taking time, we're going to read on chapter 8, verse 5, you find Aaron's rod caused the plague of frogs. Chapter 8, verse 16, the rod caused the plague of lice. Chapter 9, verse 23, let's look at that one briefly. Chapter 9, verse 23. Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Eternal sent thunder and hail and fire, darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So again, it brought the fiery hailstorm. Then chapter 10, verse 13, you find it brings, so Moses stretched out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind all day and all night, and the morning rose, it brought locusts, a plague of locusts. So we find all the way through here that this rod is used showing and evidencing as God's miracles, God's intervention, God's miracles. And we find, if we go right on through, as we go on through here, you find in Exodus chapter 14, the rod was used to do what? To part the Red Sea. God's deliverance in parting the Red Sea. God's deliverance and his miracles to take care of his people. God was able to divinely, miraculously take care of the people. That rod just simply symbolized God's intervention, symbolized what God was doing. and God's miraculous care, God's miraculously rescuing them. Remember what happened when they met the Amalekites. And we find that Moses' rod was used for the victory. Moses' rod was used for the victory. Then Exodus chapter 17, verse 5 and 6. Exodus 17, verses 5 and 6. Let's look at this one again now. Just skipping through some of these. Exodus chapter 17. Verse 5. Eternal said to Moses, go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Take also in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out. Great flood of waters feeding 3 to 5 million people. It's a lot of water, you know. So again, uses to bring water out of the rock in the desert. Now look at verse 9. Exodus chapter 17. Verse 9, and Moses said to Joshua, choose some of the men and go fight with Amalek tomorrow. And I'll hold the rod of God in my hands. So here it's called the rod of God. Goes from various Moses' rod, Aaron's rod, the rod of God, but it's all the same one. So now it's used to have Israel to defeat his enemies. It shows God's protection and his miraculous deliverance, doing miracles for the benefit of his people. You know, we had miracles in our lives. Yeah. Calling was the first one. Opening our mind was one. We've all had other miracles God's done for us. How soon we forget. One of the purposes of the rod in the Ark of the Covenant was, I take care of you. I provide miracles. I'll take care of you with miracles if I need to. I will deliver you and I'll take care of you with miracles. Now we come to the passage that tells us about the budding of the rod. You know, there had just been a rebellion of the children of Israel, just been a rebellion against God's leadership, just been where things bang and happen, and all of a sudden, oh no, what are we going to do now? The very next day, the people accused Moses and Aaron of killing the rebels that God killed, even though the people were killed in absolute rebellion against God. So let's look at Numbers chapter 17. Numbers, the 17th chapter. Again, a very interesting occurrence here. Numbers chapter 17. The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and get from them a rod from each father's house. All are leaders according to their father's house. 12 rods, write each man's name on the rod. And you shall take Aaron's name on the rod of Levi. For there shall be one rod for the head of each tribe. Then you shall place them on the tabernacle of meeting before the testimony, and it shall come to pass that the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel. Even God was a little optimistic here, I think. I'll rid myself of the complaints. Didn't last very long. But it did happen. It did happen. Notice, go down to verse 9. Go down to verse 9. Then Moses brought out all the rods before the Lord, and they looked at each one, and each man took his rod, and the Lord said to Moses, bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony, to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me, lest they die. So again, verse 8, when it came out the next day, and Moses went in, and Aaron's rod had blossomed and brought forth almonds. Not only had it blossomed, it actually produced fruit overnight. Again, an absolute miracle from God, again showing where God was working. So not only did the rod of Aaron show God's deliverance and God's miracles, but it also showed where God was working. It also showed where God was working. And again, the rod was to be kept in the ark as a reminder against rebellion and as a sign, this is where the Eternal's working. This is where the Eternal's working. In chapter 10 of Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 5. So we find that God is very plain in the way he's dealing with these things. We find it's very important what he put in there. God didn't decide on just any old thing to put in there. Everything he put in was of vital importance. And that rod symbolizes power, symbolizes miracles. It symbolized his protection. Now let's go to here to Deuteronomy chapter 10, begin reading in verse 3. So I made an ark of acacia wood, hewed 2 tablets of stone like the first, and went up to the mountain, having the 2 tablets in my hand. And he wrote the tablets according to the first writing of the 10 Commandments. And I came back down from the mountain and put the tablets in the ark which I had made, and there they are, just as the Lord had said. So, again, it is again designated here, as we go on, that's designated as the rod of Moses, or the rod of God. So we look at it, and we find that all these things are very, very plain. It was put in the Ark of the Covenant as a sign of where God was working and warning against rebellion, and also as a reminder of God's protection of his flock, the miracles he did for his people, in delivering them and protecting them and taking care of them. He always got through with them. He always made it through with them. He always did it right. He reminded them that God will always indeed be there, and that God's will ultimately be done. That rod, God's will is going to ultimately be done, not only for them, but for all mankind, brethren. We need to remember all the wonderful works and miracles God has done for his church, both today and down through time. God has the power to rescue and to protect the people from all adversities and all troubles. We have to go through it, yes, but we go through it, not into it and die and drop off. We'll go through it with God's help, and we get through to the other side. Okay, now, what about the third item that was in the ark? The 2 tablets of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. We know, we found all the way back in Exodus chapter 25, God said, you shall put the 2 tablets in the ark. Again, we know that the law of God is the basis for life and is central to God's covenant relationship. It's called the Ark of the Covenant, the box of the covenant. In that, you had to have the very basic thing that was central to the covenant of God. God's covenant is based on, I will do this and you do that. I will provide for you, I'll bless you, I'll make you a great nation, I'll even make you my sons and daughters eventually, if you obey me and you listen to me and you follow my laws, follow my way of life. But again, the law sums up how the love of God is. It sums up how to love our neighbor. Again, it gives instructions on how to live successfully. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Don't need to take quite as much time with this one, because this one's more obvious. Not that it's lighter, but it's just more obvious, more than most of us would have thought about that going in there, obviously, but probably not the other 2 items. Chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, verses 5 to 9. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second, which I command you today, that shall be in your heart, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you're in your house, when you walk. Again, talk about it all the time. When you're sitting around at home, have a discussion on them. When you're out walking, teach God's way. Teach about them when you're out walking. By the way, when you lie down and when you rise up, we'll make them the last thing you're thinking about at night. God's way is what we're thinking about when we go to bed. God's way is what we're thinking about when we get up the next morning. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. The way we live our lives. Our hand talks about how we're living. They have to be a part of how we live our life. And they shall be as frontless between your eyes and our mind constantly. You shall write them on the doorposts of your home and on your gates. Again, they are foundational to the way we live our lives, foundation to our household and the way we go about life. So it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers and your sons, talks about all these various things, Verse 17 says, then beware lest you forget the Lord. Verse 12, lest you forget. You know, it's amazing how many times we find in the Bible, especially in the first 5 books, lest you forget, lest you forget. So what does man do? He forgets. The 3 items that were in that box were there, lest we forget. They're to be a central part of our lives. And again, we explain them to each generation. You go on down through here and find in verse 17 of chapter 6, you shall diligently teach them the Lord to your God testimonies and the statutes, and you shall do what is right in the sight of God. You know, we're to keep the words of the covenant and do them that you can prosper. God blesses according to our obedience. So again, that fits right in with God's protection, God's provision, and God's constant concern for us. Now, Psalm chapter 25, let's look at one of the Psalms. Psalm chapter 25. Psalm chapter 25. Verse 10, all the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth to such as keep his covenant and his testimonies. The Ark of the Covenant was the box of the covenant. The 10 Commandments are an essential part of that covenant relationship. God says, I will love you, I will always be there, but this is what you have to do. This is what you have to do. Keep the words of the covenant before you. Keep them there. As we think about the tablets of the covenant containing God's law in the ark under God's mercy seat, we again realize God's in charge. God will take care of us as we follow him. As we follow him. Even though Israel broke the covenant, God will still determine to keep the terms of it. Look at Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2. This is interesting because Judges is a book that has about ups and downs of Israel. The last phrase of the whole book says, every man did that was right in his own sight. But let's see what God says here in Judges chapter 2. Again, it's very important as we begin to wrap up here. Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2. And beginning to read in verse 1. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you from the land which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. God says, I will never break my covenant with you. God is still faithful to that covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has several items in it as the very basis and the foundation underneath the throne of God, on which God's whole government is based, that talk about what God does. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will never break my covenant relationship. Even though they broke it, God is still working to reconcile them back to him and will ultimately do that in the millennium and in the great white throne judgment time at the end of that. You know, God will never be the one to leave the covenant relationship with us. We can leave it, be chastened, repent, and come back, and God will once again have that covenant relationship. Or we can leave it and stay gone, forfeiting that covenant relationship, and pay the penalty. But God himself will never leave that relationship. God will again ultimately remember the covenant when he brings Israel back out of captivity. Eventually his people will remember their ways and be ashamed of the ways, and he'll reestablish his covenant with them. They'll again hear about and learn about God's protection, about God's provision, about God's taking care of them and providing everything they need. Let's look at Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah 31. There's a couple of more passages here. Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 33. Jeremiah 31, Verse 31 says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers, that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. Again, those tables of the Ten Commandments were absolutely vital to the Ark of the Covenant, the covenant of God. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They shall be my people. It's going to happen. Let's look over at the next chapter, chapter 32, and verse 40. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them, no turn away from doing them good, but I will put my fear in their hearts, so that they will not depart from me. God's covenant with his people will be an everlasting covenant, but then finally they will learn and won't depart from it anymore. That is all what was in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, let's go back to our little story at the beginning, okay? After the man died, and they all got together, the box was located, and it was opened at the reading of the will. Excitement and anticipation was all over, all around. When it was finally opened, everyone was absolutely shocked and very disappointed. Very disappointed. In the box were the following: his wife's wedding ring, a lock of her hair, baby pictures of each of his 5 children, a letter from his wife that he'd written to him when he was away, working away, telling him how much she missed him and needed him, their marriage license, and a few other mementos. To the average person looking at it, there was nothing valuable at all there, as others would look at it. But to the one involved, the one who put it together, it was invaluable to him, because each one of those reminded him of his life, reminded of his love and his family. At first glance, those items in the Ark of the Covenant might seem of little value, and why would they put those in there? But they're extremely valuable to God, and they should be so to us, to his people. So now we see why. God chose the things that were put in the Ark of the Covenant to be there. They were very, very important. They were very central to his covenant relationship. They reminded his people of his covenant presence, his always constant presence there with them, his taking care of them. They reminded them of his perfect care and feeding them both physically and spiritually. As his people considered the items, they remembered his miracles in protecting them and in delivering them. They were reminded of where he was working and to be careful not to rebel against him. They were also reminded that the tables of the covenant showed God's love and showed them the very basis for that covenant relationship, showed them that very basis of how to reciprocate the love of God and how to love their neighbors. Perhaps most of all, they reminded them of God's mercy and his being ever present, able to take care and willing to do so, that he would never leave them and would always be there with them. Brethren, today, hopefully as we consider these things, we begin to realize the very basis for all God's dealings with us were in the Ark of the Covenant. Just as he did for ancient Israel, God's going to feed us. God's going to nourish us with perfect nutrition in the food spiritually. God will always supply our needs on a daily basis as we go to him daily. He will rescue us and protect us supernaturally with miracles if necessary. And above all, he'll never leave us nor forsake us. As he was with them, he'll always be there.
Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. All right, brethren, it's time to close services, so let's all stand and take our hymnals, and let's turn to page 155. And after which we sing this, I have Mr. Carl Childs to close with prayer. Page 155, For I Am Called by Your Name. Now, to close with prayer, Mr. Carl Childs.
Almighty God, we do come to you at the close of this service, and we do thank you for this message. We thank you that you have put below your mercy seat the things that we need to know and what they represent. So we pray that you'll help us to keep these in mind, help us to remember that we are beneath your mercy seat. So we do ask that you bless us. Please bless those that could not be here today, and please touch them, have them here next week. We do ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.